This is the first of several lectures on Europe, and we're starting off with several guiding questions. The first is, how did Europe come to have such wide-reaching and persistent influence around the world? And the second, what challenges does Europe face in the years ahead? A couple of images of Europe. Some of you may have had the opportunity to travel to Europe. We have famous landmarks like the Arc de Triomphe in Paris in the lower right-hand corner, and a picture that I believe is Copenhagen in the upper right-hand corner, and then rural farmlands in southern France. So we'll start off with a map showing our world realms, and you can see Europe shown in the middle. You see bordering to the south the North Africa and Southwest Asia realm. To the east, of course, Russia, a little cut off on the screen, as well as transition zones. The most notable one showing there is the country of Belarus, which has a foot firmly planted in the Russian sphere, but another in the Europe sphere. So within the realm of Europe, we're going to be looking at 5 regions within this larger realm, and you see them listed there: Western Europe, the British Isles, Northern Europe, Mediterranean Europe, and Eastern Europe. And I draw a dividing line here to indicate the wealthier parts of Europe, the wealthier regions, Northern, Western, and the British Isles, and the poorer areas of Mediterranean Europe and Eastern Europe. And you'll notice the red line indicating the European core boundary. These are the areas of greatest wealth, most advancement in terms of infrastructure, most advanced economies. And outside of that, of course, is the periphery, which is going to be less developed, more dependent on natural resources, and providing resources in many cases to the core. A look at the physiography or the physical landscapes of Europe shows an alpine system dominating around the Alps, which are seen separating the boot of Italy, the famous Italian peninsula, from mainland Europe. You also see the Pyrenees, the Carpathians, the Balkan Peninsula, which includes the Dinaric Alps. These are some of the more mountainous parts of the continent. And you can see a gradual sloping downwards in the north, especially towards the North European lowland. This is the agricultural heartland of Europe. And then we see the western uplands anchored by the Scandinavian peninsula and extending through into the British Isles and to Iceland, which is the most isolated part of the European realm, culturally connected to Europe, geographically almost situated halfway between Europe and North America. Iceland, that is. Okay, if we talk about climates, you want to review your introductory chapter that talks about the Köppen classification system for climates. But what you'll notice here is a predominance of C climates. You see a few B climates, you see some H climates, you see some D climates, but the C climates predominate, and these are going to be your mild mid-latitude climates. Specifically, the CS, CSA, and CSB climates are classified as Mediterranean climates, keeping in mind that California also is a Mediterranean climate. And then CFB and CFA being humid subtropical climates, which receive year-round precipitation. They don't have the summer drought that we see in the Mediterranean climate. So effectively, the Mediterranean is found in California, the humid subtropical in the eastern United States, if you're looking for similar areas that have these climatic conditions. And of course, you'll notice that as you move eastward, especially into Eastern Europe and Russia, now you start to get into the cold mid-latitude climates of Eastern Europe and Russia. If you move southward, especially into North Africa, you'll see a predominance of desert and semi-arid, as denoted by the B climate. So one of the things we look at in talking about Europe is its relative location, and this map is designed to show the centrality of Europe's relative location. Europe in the center of the image. You can see North America above it to the left, Asia, Africa, and you'll note this proximity of Europe to these different land masses. And so when we talk about Europe's relative location, its relationship to other places, it is described as being at the heart of the land hemisphere. It has moderate distance to other lands, which is an important consideration when one considers the role that Europe played in colonizing and interacting with other land masses around the globe. Its proximity to water was a key factor. So not only do you have convenient access to the open ocean, but you also have sheltered bays and seas. Of course, the Mediterranean is a sheltered sea. We also have the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea. Many of these different bodies of water will be separated by peninsulas. For example, the Italian peninsula separates the Adriatic Sea from the Mediterranean proper. And then we also have navigable waterways, specifically rivers that you're able to take a boat on. And so these are some of the factors that contributed to the development of maritime societies that eventually ended up sailing to distant lands and colonizing the far reaches of the globe. Europe is one of the world's great population clusters. This map from the textbook shows the Eastern Hemisphere and 4 population clusters. You see Europe indicated along with 2 locations in China and 1 in India. So we're going to see some of the highest population densities in the world. Population density here indicated in persons per square mile, and also a high level of urbanization. You have a large percentage of the population living in cities. Some of the characteristics of population of Europe: you have a very high cultural diversity, as indicated by different ethnic groups, different cultural practices, different language families and language groups. Europe is also in a phase in the start of the 21st century of low birth rates. The number of births per female as a measure of birth rate have been declining as people are electing to not have children. It's a bit of a cultural shift, also a practical reality that children are expensive, especially in more urban environments. Europe also, partly as a result of their low birth rate, has an aging population and a shrinking working age population, which is a concern in terms of maintaining a thriving economy. And concerns with migrants and refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. This has been one of the defining processes that has been taking place affecting Europe in recent decades, especially as migrants flee environmental change and drought in North Africa and the wars in the Middle East, most recently the war in Syria, and of course with shrinking birth rates. We're going to start to see immigrants representing a larger percentage of the population in these places, which raises its own issues and concerns. We think of Europe as very influential in the world, when in reality many of the most important innovations occurred outside of Europe, most notably the Middle East, but the Far East as well, including writing, language, the wheel, agriculture, and some of the systems of government that are employed. So we'll take a brief run through some of the seminal historical events and periods in Europe, and we'll start with historic Greece, which is the foundation of Western thought. Literature, architecture, art, mathematics, democracy are all traced to this flowering of human creativity and intellect, and is something that whose legacy is still felt today. Excuse my cough. Okay, next we'll look at the Roman Empire, which of course inherited a lot from Greece, but mastered administration, military, government control, and an economic system that was connected in particular through a very advanced system of roads and infrastructure. As a result, from Rome, deep in Italy, the Roman Empire controlled all the way from the mouth of the Mediterranean northward to the British Isles, eastward to Turkey, north towards Germany, south into North Africa. A very sophisticated and highly developed civilization. It's worth noting that Islam had a footprint in Europe, a foothold in Europe during the 12th century, when Islam expanded out of North Africa, out of the Middle East and Mesopotamia into Spain and Portugal. This is before being pushed out during the period known as the Crusades. And then we entered this period known as the Dark Ages, where many of the prior advancements in science, mathematics, philosophy were buried under fear, superstition, plague. Many great libraries were burned and knowledge was lost. And this was a period of disease and lack of sort of forward development. But in the 15th century, we saw this flowering in Europe, scientific revolution, the agrarian revolution, industrial revolution, and a variety of political revolutions, as we shall see in a few moments. Okay, the scientific revolution we will see emerging in 15th century, around this period known as the Renaissance, and we see many of the great art and architecture, such as this church that you see in the image, are traced to this period. But this is also where we see the emergence of science, system of fact and logic being used to explain the way of the world, and challenging many superstitions, challenging the church and its control over the population. And during this time we see these great innovations in art and architecture, and also navigation, importantly, as this heralds the period known as the Age of Exploration, when Columbus and Magellan and other great explorers set out on the open seas, and this would in turn bring about a system of mercantilism. You think of the prefix merchant, so selling and buying and trading, which had been going on for a long time in the Mediterranean, but now it expanded outward, southward into Africa, eventually into the Americas, across the Pacific and into Asia. And colonialism, where systems of government were set up from the base in Europe into these faraway lands, largely to be able to control the flow of resources and materials, in many cases subjugating the populations of these places. We'll talk more about the impacts of colonialism in the weeks to come. The agrarian revolution occurred in the 1700s in Europe, and we saw these advancements in crop varieties and cultivation methods, in storage and distribution, and these in turn led to increases in food production, which in turn increased populations. With fewer farmers needed, you saw more people moving into cities, and as we'll see in a moment, this is associated with a period as well when we began to see industrialization taking place and the growth of cities. So the Industrial Revolution, similar time period, we're now in the mid-17th century, where we see technical innovations such as the steam engine and the power loom, first in England, later expanding outward toward France and Germany. Coal and iron were sort of the key resources. So coal is the source of energy, iron is the principal ingredient in steel, and this led to a very rapid level of urbanization as reflected in the figures here. So cities were the exception, less than 10% of the population living in cities as of 1800, and by 1900 you were at almost 2/3 of the population living in cities at 62%. Okay, so political revolutions. Arguably, political revolutions have been going on for a very long time in Europe, but in particular here we want to talk about the French Revolution because this birthed the European state model, which is the model of the modern state, as we learned about in Chapter 1. World Wars I and II, of course, devastating. World War I was called the War to End All Wars and was followed shortly by World War II, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust. Most of us have heard and learned about these. Later, we had the fall of the Iron Curtain and communism in the early 1990s. The Balkan War in Yugoslavia. And so these are some of the political revolutions that have occurred and continue to unfold, although not to the extent. There are no full-blown wars, but there are a number of separatist movements and other things that lead to ongoing political and social unrest in parts of Europe. Okay, so some of the terms and concepts that we've gone through, a few that we have yet to talk about. The von Thunen model is associated with the agrarian revolution, a way to model how agricultural practices occurred and how they occurred geographically. More intensive planting of crops, more intensive crops closer into the city, more extensive agricultural operations like grazing of livestock happening further away. And it's a way for geographers to sort of understand processes that are affecting the way that the land develops. Okay, a couple of other terms in here that we'll address in the next section.